Everybody, and welcome to the second session of Scientists Warning Europe's Climate and Biodiversity Crisis Briefing for councillors and council staff. We're delighted to welcome some fantastic councillors and representatives of councils here today with success stories in taking their action on the climate and biodiversity crisis, hopefully to inspire us and for us to mercilessly copy, because that's the only way we can address an emergency, is to be most complimentary and copy everything that these great people have been doing. So let's try and mercilessly do that. I'll introduce Scientists Warning Europe again very briefly now. Some of you will have heard it already, but I want to make sure that everybody has got the background to what we're doing. The Scientists Warnings are three. The first one was issued in 1992. It was sponsored by the Union of Concerned Scientists, and it was issued by 1,700 scientists at the time, which was just before the incidence and widespread use of email, including more than half the Nobel Prize winners in science. And they said at the time that we were on a collision course with the biosphere. They recommended all the actions we should be taking to put it right and called us urgently to take them. Of course, in general, we ignored most of those actions that needed to be taken. And so 25 years later on, in 2017, the Alliance of World Scientists issued the World Scientists Warning to Humanity, a second notice, which was signed by 15,000 scientists when it was issued and is now signed by over 20,000 scientists. And within that, those scientists said that we had pretty much ignored what the first lot said, that everything had got worse quicker than they'd said, and that the need for urgent action was now yesterday and we needed to get on with it. The scientists didn't stop there. On the 5th of November 2019, the Alliance of World Scientists sponsored another article, which was issued at the time by 11,000 scientists. It's now 15,000 scientist signatories, which was issued saying that we now need to take action in 6 main areas extremely urgently: nature, food, short-lived pollutants, sustainable economy, energy, and population. The scientists have issued a number of other statements since then, but they're the 3 main warnings. The most important thing about these warnings is that they've been issued by such vast numbers of scientists, and they are possibly the most endorsed scientific articles in existence. So from that, Scientists Warning Europe is driving science-led action on the climate crisis. And that's why session 1 today had 4 scientists speaking, and session 3 will have 3 scientists speaking in it. But we have to come to the action bit. And that's what we're on about today. It's the actions that have been taken and the inspiration we can take from those people that have already been doing it. So with that, I'd like to move on to introduce the first of our panel, who is Councillor Edwina Hannaford, Cabinet Leader for Cornwall Council, Neighbourhoods, Localism and Devolution and Climate Change. Please, Edwina, thank you so much for being here with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I just hope the tech doesn't fail me as I share my screen. Bear with me. There we go. Okay. Can you see my screen okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Midland, good morning and greetings from Cornwall. It's so really wonderful and an absolute honour to be invited to speak at this event today, to be considered worthy of standing on this virtual stage alongside world's top scientists and fellow councillors is a great tribute to all the climate emergency work taking place in Cornwall. So as one of the UK's least developed regions, our rurality is one of our biggest challenges, yet in developing our response to climate change is our biggest strength, with our countryside and our ocean offering opportunities for solutions. In realising how vulnerable geographically and economically Cornwall is to climate change, we declared an emergency back in January 2019. We prepared a holistic carbon neutral Cornwall action plan to help fight climate change, tackle inequalities and bring benefits to how well our communities are able to live and prosper in the future. Social justice was really important to councillors, and we set a target for the whole of Cornwall to reach net carbon neutrality by 2030. In aiming for 2030 and not the government's 2050 target, we were very aware that we were setting ourselves a challenging deadline, which may prove impossible to achieve. but we know we had to act, and we had to act quickly. But we weren't coming from a standing start. We weren't starting from scratch. We had the foundations of our previous Green Cornwall programme, our environmental growth strategy, and the 50-50 future Cornwall strategies to build on. It was important to understand Cornwall's carbon footprint and our highest emitting sectors to inform the areas we needed to focus on. So we partnered with the Exeter University, who produced the 2030 and 2050 carbon neutral scenarios for Cornwall. This shaped our plans, identified key milestones, and helped to shape our partnership approach and governance. We audited the council's own carbon footprint as well, and we spoke to thousands of residents to understand their views on the options we were considering. The action plan that resulted was comprehensive, with over 120 actions and a requirement for £70 million of capital funding. It was important to acknowledge our role in the system as system leaders. So we based our action plan around 3 pillars to deliver our ambition for Cornwall, our people and our planet. And they are an operational programme focusing on getting our own house in order and practicing what we preach, and leading by good example and sharing good practice. The areas we can facilitate as an enabler or partner through funding, policy and partnership working, and where we can build on our strong track record of delivery and work with the government to secure additional powers and funding and new legislation to respond to the climate emergency. Whilst the council is in control of our decisions and actions to become carbon neutral council, we fully appreciate how vital it is for everyone to understand what will be different in a carbon neutral Cornwall is how we all live, how we work, how we travel. If we are to bring one and all with us on this challenging journey, we have to be honest. We have also always been clear that Cornwall Council cannot deliver on this ambitious task alone, and supporting Cornwall's communities and residents to change how they think and behave is a vital and challenging aspect of our programme. Cornwall produces about 1.5% of the carbon footprint of Cornwall, so 98.5% is the rest of Cornwall. So we have developed a sector partnership group made up of representatives from transport, energy, agriculture and other sectors to better understand and use the expertise of organisations across Cornwall. Working on a hive mind approach, we have developed the Carbon Neutral Cornwall Hive, an online engagement platform to share information and knowledge for inspiration. And we have held online masterclasses showcasing some of Cornwall's great projects. But we can't be everything to everybody, and we can't do it for them. We're not the mother. Not all of Cornwall's 113 town and parish councils are proactive, and trying to get some councils to take action, and while supporting the progressive groups with their own ambitions, is quite tough. Developing and sharing resources could and should be easier. We have developed an online climate literacy training course for all our staff, and that will be rolled out to all new members after the election. But the mechanics to share it wider are frustratingly torturous. The lockdowns brought a halt to our community climate action workshops, and they have filled the gaps themselves, which is fantastic. We are now working collaboratively with the Cornwall's Climate Action Network. It's a network of 50 groups to help grow action in town and villages right across Cornwall. And we have behaviour change campaigns planned for when we have all settled into whatever the new normal of living is. Forgive me for an incredibly complex and busy slide. You can look at that at your leisure afterwards, but governance is an essential part delivering on our ambitions. And this slide is a visualization of the complexities within which we work and the scale and ambition of approach, which was realigned to mirror our post-pandemic recovery and renewal. With a climate change board to ensure strategic oversight and our chief executive as the senior representing officer, a programme delivery group to embed ownership and accountability within services, and an overview and scrutiny committee to direct and ensure wider engagement and ownership of the plan. And of course, the Cornwall Leadership Board, which declared their own climate emergency, have oversight of the facilitation, regional and national elements of the programme. So what have we been up to? So in adopting the action plan, Cabinet agreed 3 priority areas of work for transformational effect, which are whole house retrofit pilot, the climate emergency development plan document or DPD, and our forest for Cornwall. So focusing on the whole house retrofit project, in developing these actions, we became one of the 5 areas to secure government innovation funding to deliver whole house retrofit pilot to improve the efficiency of our council-owned homes and reduce their emissions by over 75%. With half of Cornwall actually off gas grid and over 70,000 solid wall properties, retrofitting is an important aspect of our action plan, and the pilot results will inform our next ask of government for the funding and skills required to deliver a mass retrofit of Cornwall's housing stock. Identifying homes suitable for retrofitting limited our choice to clusters of properties, and the government's deadlines and embargoes were challenging. But our start date was put back twice due to COVID lockdowns, but having expanded our programme with other government funding, when complete, we would have retrofitted over 200 homes and fitted over 600 PV installations. So the Climate Emergency Development Plan document. This will set the policy to protect our environment, encourage better development that uses less energy and allocate land for renewables and carbon sequestration, along with our second ask of government to improve future home standards and prevent retrofitting problems in the future. As a unitary authority, it's been more straightforward for us to develop a climate emergency DPD, and we are now at the final stages of the formal consultation before we submit for examination. Cornwall's residents have a love-hate relationship with planning, and fellow councillors, I think, will relate to that. To add to that, the COVID lockdown made public consultation more challenging, and we had to undertake a lot of our engagement digitally. But we have been able to hold some face-to-face events, obviously observing COVID-safe procedures in the latter stages of the plan. And the forest for Cornwall. In speaking to people on the doorsteps and street corners, we learned that trees and nature were important to many of them. We developed the forest for Cornwall as our natural solution to climate change to help sequester carbon from the atmosphere. The 8,000 hectare forest will be grown across Cornwall with the support of partners, but it's not just one big forest. It could be trees, it could be a single tree, it could be an orchard, a copse, hedges, and the use of other natural climate change, such as wildflower meadows and marine eelgrass, for example. There is a general shortage of trees to plant, and we are dedicating areas of our own council-owned farms, 11,000 acres across Cornwall, to become tree nurseries. We also need the land to plant the trees on and the volunteers to plant them, all of which is a gift in the gift of the good people of Cornwall and our partners. An additional key action that's been developed is our decision-making wheel in response to Cabinet concerns that no Cornish resident or business should be worse off as a result of our response to the climate emergency. Based on the Kate Raworth Donut economics model, the tool has been used in all Cabinet decisions since September 2019 and ensures that social justice and environmental principles are at the heart of our decision-making. And we are further embedding the tool into our wider decision-making processes, including procurement, and for a first this year in our budget setting, placing people and planet at the core of everything we do. Delivering early activity to show our commitment to acting on climate change was vital to build momentum and keep things going and show that we are actually delivering, not just talking about it. Along with the projects that I've already mentioned, thanks to an innovative partnership with Centrica, the council funded and installed the first wind turbine in Cornwall since 2016 that is smart grid connected to overcome Cornwall's grid constraints, which is our third ask of government. and vital if we are to unlock Cornwall's renewable energy potential. We see us as the UK's powerhouse for renewables. Having invested in the UK's first deep geothermal heat and power project, the council agreed to match fund a second geothermal project at the Eden project, which you might have heard of, increasing Cornwall's potential to create a new energy sector for the UK. We are exploring green fuel as well as green energy. We have partnered with Bennaman, an innovative Cornish company who is developing biogas fuel from captured methane on 6 of the council-owned farms. The biogas is then being used in our converted highways repair and maintenance vehicles. The plan is to upscale the project on farms right across Cornwall and then the UK and perhaps the world. We have also invested in new lower emission buses, fire appliances and waste vehicles, collection vehicles, and we've ordered our first wave of electric vehicles for our fleet transition, showcasing that EVs can be a practical alternative to fossil fuel vehicles. And we've also secured £23.5 million from government to pilot a reduced bus fares scheme to encourage people to travel by bus. Prior to the pandemic, Cornwall had seen a 5% increase in public transport usage. Obviously, the pandemic has put paid to that.
Edwina, 1 minute, please.
I'm on my last slide. And as well as investing directly into schemes ourselves to respond to the climate emergency, we created 3 climate emergency grant schemes to support community action planning, low carbon and carbon sequestration projects. And only last week, we launched the Back the Future Cornwall Climate Change Fund that will enable residents, businesses and visitors to directly support Cornwall's climate emergency. Miraz, thank you. I hope you found that interesting and useful. My best advice is to stock up on perseverance and don't underestimate the power of people to make change. You will have powerful and passionate people in your own areas who care about climate change and are able and ready to help you. They may even have already knocked on your door. The best way for them to join you is to keep your door open. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you very much, Edwina. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Right. Okay. Now, if we could now introduce, please, Michael Gallagher. And Michael is the Regional Energy Projects Manager for Nottingham Council. So, Michael, over to you.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you, Ed. So thank you very much for having me along this afternoon. My name is Michael. I'm the Regional Energy Projects Manager. I lead the Midlands Energy Hub. Nottingham City Council is our accountable body. I'll take you on the talk today from the work that Nottingham City Council are doing, and I'll take it up to the work that's happening at the county and regional level as well. There's a lot of information here. I put a bit of extra information in the slides with links. So when the slides are shared afterwards, you can explore some of that information in a bit more detail if you would like. So as I mentioned, fully funded by BEIS, the role of the hub is to support the capacity of LEPs and local authorities to identify and deliver local energy strategies and projects and addressing the capacity gap that we know existed for them to be able to deliver on this work, alongside improving regional and national communication channels. With the 9 LEPs I showed on the previous slide, we've got a project officer based in each one who are working closely with those LEPs and local authorities to do the development work. We also manage something called the Rural Community Energy Fund, which provides grants to community groups for energy project development. We're managing the Green Homes Grant Local Authority Delivery Phase 2 across the Midlands, which is a regional retrofit programme funded through BEIS. And we're also managing the Green Homes Grant Skills Training Programme, which is an England-wide initiative to upskill the supply chain to work on the Green Homes Grant voucher scheme. Thank you. Next slide, please. So a local approach to energy. This is really, really important as local authorities and LEPs are key actors in facilitating the transformation of our energy system, as we've just heard about. And why does it matter? It helps with business retention, helps with productivity, economic growth, health, cross-sector cost reduction, and meeting carbon emissions reduction targets. With the Midlands Energy Hub, our local project officers provide that local presence and resource at that grassroots level. and Nottingham City Council act as the accountable body for the Midlands Energy Hub. Although the team are spread out fully across the Midlands and embedded with LEPs and local authorities across the area. This provides a brilliant opportunity to build on Nottingham's success in this area and to help support other organisations. Next slide, please. So what have Nottingham done? Well, last year on the 13th of January, they launched their carbon neutral charter for 2028 and their consultation for the 2028 action plan, which has now been completed. The link is there for you to actually go and read it. But I just want to pick out the important thing here is the fact that they've got the review, progress and actions. There's going to be an awful lot of change between now and 2028, and to be able to regularly review and assess progress and what actions need to be done and what actions need to be changed is really, really important. The other critical element here as well is the fact that Nottingham have engaged with their citizens and businesses and got their feedback in the development of the charter and the action plan. Next slide, please. So with the charter, you can see on the graph to the left of your screen that it's a real challenge to really drive down those emissions. And what's important with this is that we build up partnerships with other organisations. This is not something we're trying to do on our own. We're only responsible as a council for a small portion of those emissions. We've got to work in partnership with citizens and our other local organisations to make such a challenging difference. Next slide, please. So following on from that, the Carbon Neutral Nottingham 2020 to 2028 action plan was developed. We've got key themes running throughout. And a big part of this, as mentioned, was that public consultation. It's really important to us that we get our citizens on board and we listen to how they think the future of the city can be shaped as we drive towards this ambitious target. Again, if you would like to see how we pull this together, I've put the link there. We appreciate it's really ambitious, but we don't have time to set targets way off in the future. There's a real need to act now, and therefore there's a need to set these ambitious targets to really drive progress. Next slide, please. A few examples of Nottingham in action. Solar PV, retrofitted to over 4,000 properties across the city. Energy Sprung, deep retrofit. The ones you can see in the picture there were the first number of properties to have been done. This programme is now rolling out. So it started with about 10 properties, is now going over to over 200 properties and a school as well. So really exciting to take it into a bigger building. We're developing the really innovative vehicle to grid. So our electric fleet are expanding. We've got solar at the depot where we're looking at doing this. So we're generating the energy on site. And the idea is the vehicles often come back and are plugged in at about 4 o'clock. And that's when you're getting an increase in demand on the grid. So it's great to use the reserve in the batteries of the vehicles, sell that to the grid and then charge when there's less demand later on at night. So a great opportunity to help decarbonise the grid and also to generate revenue. Of course, there's the district heating. We've got one of the oldest district heating systems in the country, powering about 5,000 homes and over 100 businesses. Next slide, please. So just to take that to a county level, now I mentioned collaboration and working in partnership, and local authorities working together can achieve more. So with the Nottinghamshire local authorities, I'm helping to facilitate a working group that's chaired and championed by the Chief Exec of Rushcliffe Borough Council. Through that group, we've done a number of actions. I've pulled out a few key ones here. Decarbonisation of leisure centres. So we've looked at the suitability of PV across 22 of the sites. The planning officer group then went away and put together an SPD for low carbon supplementary planning documents. We're looking at decarbonisation of transport, and these are just a few. What we felt was really important is that by coming together at a senior management level, we can identify how we can actually work collectively to support each other through this journey. It's not about competition, it's about identifying strengths and weaknesses, and where one local authority is doing really well, how can they help others? You know, it's about sharing resources and moving forward, because energy and the environment doesn't respect local authority boundaries. And of course, we've got the LEP energy strategy that sits above it all that we're working to support, as well as everybody's own climate emergencies that have been declared. The Hub has also been supporting the East Midlands Councils and LGA on a workshop series And again, fantastic opportunity to collaborate across community energy, transport, energy and housing, and green economic recovery and behavioural change that have formed the themes for those workshops. Thank you. Next slide. So Rural Community Energy Fund, community engagement is absolutely key. Communities understand what they need. And through the fund we've got, we're able to help these communities develop projects in their rural areas. So an example, Cromford Mill up in Derbyshire, looking at bringing hydro back to the site. It had hydro 250 years ago, albeit not hydroelectric, but it's great to get that site back and powered by renewable energy again. Positive activities up in Lincolnshire, looking at micro anaerobic digestion. And Harbury Ewell's a community group that are using wind, solar and storage to power local EV minibuses that take community members to things like hospital appointments and the like. And recently, CSE, with support from the Energy Hub, have launched their Parish Council Carbon Calculator. I'll put the link there. For your parish councils, really recommend they have a look at it. Really easy to use and really impactful. Thank you. Next slide. In terms of some of the projects we've funded, this public-private joint venture and partnerships for investment in and delivery of energy schemes, I've sent that over to the event organisers and happy for that to be shared afterwards. Again, we've got to work in partnership with the private sector on some of these projects. So this is a really, really good way for, if you've not embarked on it before, setting out what you need to start considering. We've developed a financial model for energy projects looking at wind, hydro and solar. That we're just waiting on the legal sign-off before that can be utilised by the local authorities, but that will be available through the hub soon. And we also have worked with Coventry on the low carbon transport hub work. There's a link further on in the presentation that you can use to access it, where we did a strategic overview of the Midlands to identify suitable sites, and this work's available for all and is easy to replicate as well. And we've got in progress with Nottingham D2 grids, looking at mine water heat to heat homes, working with the North East region on a mine water heat white paper, part funded through the hubs, and a low carbon environmental goods and service sector report, which I'll touch on in more detail in a moment, and something called on-gen and on-efficiency. So we've got 100 licenses we'll be funding to identify what needs to be done on large buildings to make them more efficient, or more suitable for renewable generation. And it's essentially a piece of software that spits out a business that says, yes, invest your time and money into this, or no, think of something else, to put it simply. So we'll be replicating that across the Midlands in the coming months. Next slide, please. I mentioned the public-private joint venture there, so just a little bit more detail for you. It involves information on how to secure the project investment, how to enable the development of the project, enhance and accelerate the delivery of a wide range of energy infrastructure projects, and how to integrate the energy projects, looking at generation, grid constraints, mobility, heat, and digital solutions. Thank you. Next slide. That I just mentioned on the project summary there. So the low carbon and environmental goods and service sector report we've conducted for the whole of the Midlands. Again, this is replicable for the other regions. It was commissioned in November 2020. The work has just been completed. We're just reviewing it now before we make it public. The aim of the work was to define and understand the sector, where support is needed to help grow it across the Midlands from a local authority level, a LEP level and a regional level, and understand the role the sector has to play in the low carbon recovery from COVID-19, and also to quantify it. So for the Midlands, the value of the sector is over 26 billion. And I know for the LEP I'm responsible for, the LEP area I'm responsible for, it's worth 5.3 billion. And it's really impactful being able to put clear figures to that and identify which subsectors are adding value and have a scalable and can really benefit the GVA of the region should they be invested further in. I've put some links on there as well, that you can look at some of the initial outputs from the work. And again, the full report will be available end of March, early April. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Michael, 1 minute, please.
Thank you. If we can just hop on to the next slide. There we go. And then just to finish off on the low carbon transport hubs, the idea came from Coventry City Council. I've been working with Cenex on this concept, and the Midlands Energy Hub helped helped to fund this project and to take it Midlands wide. So we followed the process there where we looked at a shortlist criteria for all the sites, built that long list, and then supported that long list to be condensed to a shortlist and then refine the report. Shall we go on to the next slide, please? So this is the methodology that we used. Again, this is very much replicable in other areas. And importantly, Coventry City Council used the dark blue for their particular site they've been looking at. And then we expanded that because there needs to be a degree of flexibility as we look at this challenge across the region on how we support the transport sector, which is so key to the Midlands economy, to transition to low carbon fleets. So again, I think what's great about this work is it sets out our ambitions and other areas can replicate it really, really easily. Thank you. Next slide, please. So there's the project link to that report. That's the last slide. I've done a bit of a whistle-stop tour throughout a whole range of work, but if anybody does have any further questions, please do feel free to drop me a link. And my email is on the last slide, if you could click through to it, please. Thank you very much for listening today, and I hope you found it useful.
Thank you very much, Michael. A very, very detailed talk there. And please can everybody keep their questions coming, and where you have a question that overlaps with somebody else, then you may want to add something in that adds to their question, and we'll try and get to them all later on. Writing now, Councillor Steve Hastings, so Cabinet Member for Environment, Heritage and Waste Management at the Isle of Wight Council.
Good afternoon, Ed and everybody. Apologies for my late arrival. We were double booked on another meeting on coastal matters and what have you, which we had to attend as well. Anyway, we're here now. I'm hoping that my officers are here as well somewhere, because we do have a presentation of slides that can be shared if that would be possible.
So hopefully everyone can see that.
Yes,
we can. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you, Holly. Yeah, in the modern tradition. Next slide, please, Holly. Okay, right. Our overall, this is our background, our vision. We are on the island a Conservative administration, and there is our vision to be an inspiring place in which to grow up, work, live and visit. The work part of that is quite important. Currently, we're rolling out broadband extensively to get better connected, because if we're better connected, we can get more employment, and people will stay on the island rather than get educated and leave to have to go somewhere else. So that's quite an important factor for us. And of course, that leads on to think about where we're going forwards in climate change and infrastructure. We're quite a rural area, as you can imagine, so some of the challenges are different. So in a city, it has to be said. I'm sure Cornwall will probably have similar issues. Our corporate strategy, as you can see, environment, unique island characteristics, and that's part of our challenge as well. Outstanding transport connectivity, well, that's a challenge as well as an island. You can imagine we're very reliant on ferries and the workings of ferries, etc. Isle of Wight is a leading UK visitor destination, and probably this coming year will be more so than ever, I should imagine, because we're going to have a lot more staycations going forward. Next slide, please, Holly. So that leads us to where we were in July 2019, when I was approached by one of our opposition members, who is an independent now, was Green Party at the time. I do like to work collaboratively across party, across our council. I think it's quite important. So I was approached to support the motion that he was going to bring to the council for full council. And I thought, yeah, I can work with that. But when he sent a copy over to me, which basically was a copy and paste of Portsmouth City Council's declaration they'd just passed, I think the previous week, that's where it became a little bit more tricky from my perspective, because being a Conservative administration, and some of our members in my group would readily admit they are climate skeptics. So my first battle was to work with the wording, and the wording that we had initially was quite extensive. It was a bit too rambling, and the first half of it talked about Manchester. And of course, one or two of my group were saying, well, what's it got to do with Manchester? So that became instantly a bit of a challenge of how do I redo this and reword it. So I rewrote it, sent it back over to him. He came back, and we backwards and forwards collaboratively till we got the wording right, which is what we have here. So we're looking to declare a climate emergency, develop an action plan, and that's very important as well. I'm becoming quite known in our council, I think, for whenever we have a strategy come forward, it has to have an action plan, because a strategy without an action plan is a piece of paper. So that was very important that we can't just do it, you've got to have a plan of where you're going with it. And you see our aim is to be carbon neutral by 2030. And as it says there at the bottom there, assess the science. That's very important, because you can't just wish for something and hope you can do it. You've got to know what's behind it and how you're going to achieve it. So next slide, please, Holly. Oh yes, and rapidly on the heels of our declaration of climate emergency, we also had a motion on our biosphere. We are a Unesco Biosphere now. We have that status, which is fantastic. And again, that's brilliant for tourism, because somebody could be sat the other side of the world looking on the UNESCO website and see who has biosphere status, and the little old Isle of Wight has it. So part of their visitation is going to be to us, which is fantastic. And we're just really trying to achieve, we have AONB, a great chunk of our island, and we're trying to get dark skies designation as well. So if we can put all that together, it would be fabulous. And then, so from my perspective, that's the lead in, how we got there. I mean, there's how do you declare a climate emergency? You have to declare it via a motion. So we got that together, and why? Well, the reason why was really to give political direction to the council to install right through the council a climate change thinking into the DNA of the council. So everything that we do, and everything, whatever areas from procurement through to everything that we do is now got climate change in there. Right, so from here, I'm going to pass over to Holly Jones now to run through the next slides.
Hi there, everyone. So I've come into the council a few months ago to work on the climate strategy and action plan. So starting with baseline. So other than the baseline carbon footprint, which we'll actually come back to later, Isle of Wight Council has got various baselines to work from when we've produced the action plan. These are spread across various areas that feed into the action plan. So some of the ones that we're currently working with are that 36% of homes on the island are currently well insulated. So we've been able to set a target around this to improve energy efficiency. Because the Isle of Wight is a very rural area, well, a lot of rural areas across the island, most people do still drive to travel around the island. We're working towards improving active and sustainable travel across the island, but there are some fairly large challenges around this, particularly in those rural areas. The island currently has around 90 megawatts of renewable energy generation locally. This is, again, something that we're aiming to increase, but there are some infrastructure challenges locally that we do need to address before we can start, creating more renewable generation locally. Currently, 13% of the island is covered by trees. So this is higher than the average for England, but it doesn't really compare to other similar areas, for example, across Europe. And the Isle of Wight has already improved its recycling rate to 56%, but it is aiming for higher over the next 5 to 10 years. So this slide outlines how the council works locally. There are only quite limited actions that are directly within the council's control, and we have spent some time already communicating this and how it relates to climate action and what we can do. But there does still seem to be some question marks locally around how the council works and what exactly it can and can't do. So I'm sure a lot of people on the call are already familiar with this, but anything within council operations is relatively straightforward in terms of climate action. Not to say that, you know, it's easy, but the council just has more control to act. Anything that doesn't fall directly within council operations may end up being a lot more complex to work on. So the council has committed to supporting and influencing any stated outcomes where it can, but many of these will need to arise because of behavioural change or will need to be community-led. So this slide goes into a little bit more depth about what the council can and can't do. So again, within the council's own operations, we can make those changes relatively easily. And we expect to spend a good amount of the time over the first year or two of the strategy and action plan, embedding sustainability at the heart of the council's internal actions, like Steve had mentioned a minute ago. So there are various plans that will feed into the climate and environment strategy, and the climate and environment strategy will likewise feed into different council strategies and plans over time. And again, the wider island, so, you know, what exactly can the Isle of Wight Council facilitate and influence, and that we recognise that there are some things that will just be beyond the council's reach. So Tash, over to you for this slide.
Thank you. Hi. So the Isle of Wight, unlike some of the presentations you've seen already, are still very much in the planning and policy development phases. We have been working for a long time as a council dealing with climate change across many different of our departments, but not under an integrated climate change policy. We have over the last 10 years worked very hard to operate. We've had national conferences on climate change and landslides. We have one of the largest landslide complexes in northwestern Europe that is populated, that is suffered a lot over the years from the effects of sea level rise and subaerial erosion and collapses. So we've been dealing with climate change through our shoreline management plans and our fluvial coastal strategies, our flooding strategies historically. And now we're moving to a point where we want to draw together the sort of 20 or 30 different policies that we have into a single climate and environment strategy. But we're very much also looking at the same time as shifting from a council that looks on short-term actions to a council that looks at long-term outcomes. And we've seen this as a very opportune moment to look at that 2030, 2040 line, and where in that the science places the council estate versus the rest of the island as a whole population and environmental area in terms of reaching net carbon, or ideally carbon zero, by 2030. In terms of our own estate, we're looking very much to develop, as we said, the strategy for monitoring carbon footprint, including, as we've discovered over the last 12 months, a huge shift in the way that we work means that now 95% of our workforce are working from home. Many of them intend to continue doing so. So one of the key things we want to do right now is develop a strategy to look at how we're going to measure our carbon footprint when our workforce is no longer in many of our buildings, but are working from home, and how we include that back into our carbon modelling. We have a carbon management strategy. We've made huge successes over the last 10 years in reducing our buildings' carbon, through reducing buildings, through changing our ICT, through behaviour change activities, and we're going to continue looking at that to reach that net carbon zero by 2030. In terms of implementation, we have been quite successful recently in getting the Salix low carbon heating system project funding for 10 of the buildings that we have, where we will be changing our heating systems to air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps for 10 of our larger buildings and leisure centres. We'll be seeking further carbon initiatives in our building stock over the coming years and looking at options for cladding. We have a very, very old stock of buildings within our authority that are mostly single-skinned aluminium frame windowed, very municipal 1970s buildings that are not at all geared towards any kind of energy efficiency. So we have a lot of challenges to deal with, as well as having a server bank of our own ICT servers on the island rather than a cloud server system. So we've got a lot of small challenges to deal with. And then we want to look at embedding climate change adaptation and low carbon behaviours across our corporate DNA. One of the ways we've started doing this is through having directorate-wide officer groups, where we talk about training the entire management level to then train their own staff beneath them on carbon literacy and how to look at adaptation and resilience to climate change as part of their day-to-day living. For example, Historically, we worked very in a siloed way. We would have our low carbon projects teams would promote free insulation through Facebook and the internet and the usual ways that you advertise things. And we've taken the shift on that and said, hang on a minute, we have social care teams who go into all homes across the island and are aware where there's fuel poverty issues, are aware where there's cold homes. So we started, rather than externally advertising things in a siloed way, to getting all of our teams and all of the different areas to look at how they can build adaptation to climate change within the way that they deliver their services across social services and across learning and development and planning, and really integrate that as a core decision making, a core part of thinking as part of the greater population well-being piece, because the population needs to adapt to the changing climate, adapt to the hotter summers and the colder winters. And that's not only for climate change and carbon purposes, it's also for their well-being, and influencing the well-being of the population is one of the core purposes of a local authority. That's really how we've enabled a lot of our staff to see climate change as more than just an issue for you know, the lefties and the muesli eaters and the sandal wearers, and something that actually is relative to all of us in the way that we operate in all of our different levels of local authority service delivery. Ollie, can I have next slide? Okay, so outside of the authority's control, we have the things, as Holly said, are the outcomes that we want to achieve across our population going forward. So we want our islands community to be enabled to achieve net carbon zero themselves. One of the key ways that we've developed working with our community is the development of what we call the Environment and Sustainability Forum, which is an open forum that meets monthly. It is open to all members of the public, all active groups. I know that there's nothing wrong with the muesli, sandals and barefoot folk. I'm one of them. Just notice the comment on the side there. But we do want to enable our community to be able to achieve that. So we've started this forum where we have people from all political groups, all active groups, and all levels of community can join without any restriction on a monthly basis to come and discuss the issues at hand. We have an annual agenda for different subjects that we discuss each month, with presentations from other local authorities and universities to bring the science and bring the social surfaces and bring the different delivery models of how people deal with sustainable transport, through to electric vehicles, through to rewilding our verges into that community aspect, and then push it back out again to let our town parish councils know where they can find the funding, to know where our active groups can find funding, and to really lead and promote that engagement in those opportunities for residents to find grants and for businesses to get engaged in the programme. We call it the Environment and Sustainability Forum, and when we want to provide and enable learning opportunities to enable landowners, as you know, we are a very, very rural community. Much of the island is farmland, and we really want to start looking at landowners and engaging with biodiversity next gain. The Hampshire and Wight Wildlife Trust are currently working with a lot of adaptive farming techniques in a few areas on the island, and we're looking at training sessions. And we're talking about doing some education sessions to talk about how hedgerows are an important part of our biodiversity net gain, as well as the woodland, seagrass and kelp bed opportunities looking forward. And we want to make sure that we are providing learning opportunities to bring together the different parts of our community to look at how we can adapt our land use going forward. Next slide, please, Holly. Okay, the other big issue for us as an island, we have a severance factor. We are clearly separated from the mainland. We have a huge issue with electricity in that our grid capacity is at its maximum, and we cannot actually add any further alternative energy sources to the grid at this point in time without a new interchanger being installed under the channel, which is several £1 million cost to SSE, and they're not willing to do that without having sufficient potential sites available to buy into that to cover the cost of developing a fourth interchanger. So we've started looking at making sure that we can build some resilience in terms of what we have on the island. We're just finishing an energy from waste plant, for example, at the moment, which we're going to look at have parasitic load of electricity on a private wire network to run the nearby recycling facilities, and then also look at heat networks coming off of there to run civic buildings such as the local hospitals and prisons, which the bays have been quite positive and supportive with and looking forward to funding. So again, with energy and water resilience, we need to find ways to develop sustainable private wire networks here to step outside of the current grids. Can we look at the next one, please? The Isle of Wight Council are also, and the community are resilient to a changing climate. This is a key bit of social work side of what we want to try and change on the island, and that's to enable and support the residents of the island to ensure their homes are well insulated. We have a really high fuel poverty rate, which we want to reduce. We also are a very high retirement population, with 35% of our population in the retirement bracket. We need to make sure that as our population ages, we have care homes and sheltered homes and adaptive homes that are able to cope with colder winters and hot summers. Again, we're talking about agriculture and how we're adapting what we do in our field systems. And then the strategic infrastructure, we're clearly obviously looking at transport networks, sustainable transport, and increasing funds. Holly, you can change the slides. I've just seen my 1 to 2 minute call there, so I'm going to talk faster. We also mentioned that we do have a biosphere here, and that biosphere is really, really key to us to ensuring that we can promote using the biosphere to help our local agricultural growing businesses see that as a benefit, and see that benefit as something that we can then help them work with their carbon footprint, but also then promote things such as their products that they grow on the island as biosphere products as a part of their unique selling point. So to embrace the net biodiversity gain within the biosphere, but also then adapt the businesses and how they grow to ensure that we're lowering the carbon footprint of some of the huge greenhouse complexes that we have here. Equally, we'd like everywhere else need to look at our littering and fly tipping. I think everyone's seen that across the country has been awful this year. Holly, do you want to move on to the next one? We're short on time.
Yeah, sure. So just coming back to the carbon footprint baselines very briefly. So the Isle of Wight Council's baseline footprint is just over 4,000 tonnes, whereas the island's footprint is almost 507,000 tonnes. So coming back to that point about, what the council controls versus what's outside of our control, really only about not even 1% of emissions on the Isle of Wight is directly controlled by the council. So we've set a target of net zero with a 15% offset over the next 10 years. So just wanted to outline the island's carbon footprint as well, and the different sectors that are contributing to that. I think it's mostly fairly in line with the UK's national footprint, other than potentially domestic heating is a bit higher for the Isle of Wight, because a lot of the island is currently not on the gas network. So we have a lot of older housing stock that's still heated by oil boilers, and I think we're burning stoves a lot of the time as well. And just to wrap up, we just wanted to highlight some of the progress to date. So our climate and environment strategy is fairly new, but work has been going on in the background for quite some time now on the Isle of Wight. So I'll just whiz through these quite quickly. So the council carbon footprint has actually decreased by about 65% already since 2009. And we've received funding for works under the Cllr Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, which will be completed later on this year. I've mentioned a key aspect over the first couple of years of the plan will be around engagement. So in terms of that, we've already started the monthly forums. We're updating the council's climate change section of the website, and we're developing some work around social media and a couple of other areas as well. Active travel, the council was actually granted funding in 2019 from the Access Fund, and currently there are 19 projects underway or completed. So these have already reduced carbon from travel by just under 4,500 tonnes. In terms of waste and recycling, I've mentioned that the council has already improved its recycling rate to 56%, and it's now rated 36th in the country. There's also the new energy from waste plant in progress that Tash had mentioned. And lastly,
we have actually hit, so I'm just going to jump in with a bit of practice.
Go ahead.
Here. Sorry, we have just recently got to a point now where for the last quarter we've been at 99% diversion from landfill of all waste on the island, which is something we're very proud of in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. Sorry, carry on.
Thanks. So last point was really just around planning. So the draft island planning strategy was published, I think, early 2020, and it already contains a wide range of measures that are, aimed to lower the carbon footprint of the island and protect the island's wider environment. So this includes keeping development away from the most sensitive areas, ensuring that ecological and environment mitigation or compensation are required, along with biodiversity net gain, and it also increases support for renewable energy projects, although again we have that sort of ongoing issue with the infrastructure locally. So I think that brings us to the end.
Thank you.
Excellent, great, thank you so much. That was a fantastic effort. You got an enormous amount of information across in a short time. So brilliant, thank you very much. Sorry to call you to time, but we were running on a little bit. Right, now if I could ask for our last speaker, please. So Councillor Kevin Freer, Cabinet Member for Climate Action at Lancaster City Council, also the founder of Climate Emergency UK, of which quite a few of you will be familiar.
Okay, thanks, Ed. And can you see my slides?
No.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, hopefully it will. Right, okay, so yeah, I'm wearing two hats today. One as the Cabinet Member for Climate Action at Lancaster City Council, and the other, oh, hang on a sec, don't think it's actually, there we go. And the other as the founder of Climate Emergency UK. So I'm going to mention the broader picture first, and then move on to what Lancaster are doing. So we heard in the first session that every particle of carbon that is emitted is going to stay in the atmosphere and will need to be withdrawn. So we have to have pretty radical plans to reduce our carbon emissions. And one of the similarities of all the councils who are presenting today is a target that they have of 2030 across their whole district to get their carbon emissions to net zero. And the Commission on Climate Change make it very clear what is going to be involved in that. A wholesale transformation of several of society's most important socio-techno-economic systems: energy, transport, land use, food and buildings. And of course, all of those you've already heard from the previous three councils are areas in which the council have some influence, if not direct control. So we will need fundamental structural changes to the economy. The majority of the public actually back a 2030 target as well, and a poll done that reported in The Guardian just before the last election shows that even half of Conservative voters, and you'll notice that the last three councils were all different political control: Labour, Lib Dem and Conservative, and Lancaster Council is actually a cooperative of several different parties that run it. So it's a non-political issue, really. It's you will see that all of the climate emergency declarations that were passed were pretty much unanimous. So what are we doing at Climate Emergency UK? Well, we started with collecting all of the declarations, and that probably led to some of the cut and pasting that you've heard about. But the idea was that people could take the best ideas from other places. And
sorry, Kevin, to interrupt. There is somebody just stated there's a bit of a problem with the sound and some rattling. That may be at your end. Could I also ask everybody to mute if you're not already muted, if you're not speaking, please? But there was a bit of rattling, Kevin. Okay, I'll make sure I don't move around just in case it's me. So 71% of councils, and that's not just the ones that have declared a climate emergency, because others that didn't actually make a declaration have still come up with plans. And we have a database that we've developed with My Society, where you can find your council's action plan. You can search. So one of the suggested searches we have is electric taxis, for example. So you can find what other councils are doing about something, and you can then, as has been mentioned, shamelessly copy what they're doing. We also have been developing a local authority climate plan checklist with several other organisations. It's constantly being updated, but it gives you a framework for what we would really like to see in climate plans. And we thought we'd start looking at plans by looking at the three councils that are represented today. And there's no surprises that they come up pretty well, because they've been handpicked.
So a total of 126 local authorities have set a target of 2030 for the whole district, which is incredibly ambitious. Just listed a few of them here. All of these slides, by the way, Ed's got them, so can be passed on, so you can look at them in more detail. There's some more councils that have set a target for their whole district. And one of the things we're running now is a pledge campaign to try and get all of the candidates in the elections, regardless of political party, to commit to, if the council isn't already got a 2030 target, to follow the example of those 126 and set a 2030 target, develop an ambitious climate action plan, and make sure that it's a priority in all decisions. So I'll come on now to Lancaster City Council, and that holistic approach is one that we really enthusiastically adopted, making sure that not only addressing the climate emergency is embedded in all of our plans, but also our other cross-cutting themes of community wealth building. We're down the road from Preston. You'll have heard of the Preston model. We've been developing for a while the Lancaster version of that, but also a real emphasis on community engagement. Now, community engagement is something that you will have heard councils responsible for a small subset of emissions in their area. We've absolutely got to do this in collaboration with our communities. We discovered last night at our council meeting that we don't always get it right. I'm not pretending for a minute that Lancaster City Council is anything other than doing its best like every other council. And we've identified that at Climate Emergency UK that we really do need to learn from best practice. And I've been talking to people at the Consultation Institute. Some of you may have been on our conferences or courses, but that's something we're going to be focusing on from now on. So we have those cross-cutting priorities. We are also, the last few months, we've been developing plans around the Sustainable Development Goals and how those can be integrated. And Cornwall mentioned it, but they are working on, they've got fabulous tools for assessing projects that meet donut economics, and this donut economics grew out of the Sustainable Development Goals. So again, it's looking at holistically addressing communities that are left behind at the same time as addressing climate and biodiversity crises. So one of the things that we had was a people's jury, and the focus of the rest of this presentation really is about how, in spite of the pandemic, it's been possible to really progress with our action, with Lancaster City Council's actions on addressing the climate and biodiversity emergencies. Because we started our people's jury in January, and then of course we had the pandemic and we had to move online. We were lucky that we had started in person, so people had already built relationships, but there have been people's juries or citizens' juries that have started and completed wholly online. Blackpool has done one, and Kendal just in this part of the country. And we found that we took a complete cross-section of residents, and they were all enthusiastic about really addressing the problems. It's a great way of getting active participation from your community, with lots of the jury have carried on being engaged in follow-up meetings. The council's taking the recommendations very seriously, but Lancaster, unlike the other three councils today, is only a district council. So there are a lot of things that we can't control. So most of the recommendations we don't directly have influence over, but we know somebody who does. So the first thing that was done was that a motion was raised at Lancashire County Council, different political control, but they have agreed as well to take have a good look at the recommendations and do what they can to implement them. So some of the things we're doing in Lancaster, you have already heard that we need to know about where our emissions are coming from, and that we we need to do that before we can then address those emissions. So looking at both at all of scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, we have a dashboard. It's currently internal, but the idea is that it'll soon be made external, so people can see where emissions in the area, the council and the area are coming from. And that gives an overview to everybody, both councillors, heads of service, as well as the public, to help inform our strategy about what we need to do next and what's most impactful. You've heard SEDIC's funding mentioned. We got 6.8 million to reduce the emissions of our leisure centre. We're going to build a solar farm on the disused landfill site next door. You've heard also about grid constraints, and unfortunately we can only build a 1 megawatt farm when actually we need to build a 3 megawatt farm because, again, there isn't the grid capacity here. We're also going to put in heat pumps instead of gas boilers and upgrade the fabric of the building, particularly the glazing, to make it more energy efficient. Electric vehicles, I loved discovering this, was that Lancaster back in 1916 was one of the few places in the country where local transport was provided by buses that were battery driven. The technology has moved on since then. These just ferried munitions workers between the centre of Lancaster and the munitions factory, so it only had a range of a couple of miles. So, you know, both with things like hydropower and electric vehicles, in a sense, we're going back a century to the past and building on what we already did. So we're going to electrify all of our vehicles. We started with bin lorries, and we've purchased 2, which we haven't had delivered yet, but there's one of them that we had a trial with. Now, I've read quite a lot of councils have said, oh, we can't quite go there yet. You've got a big rural area, we've got hills, they can't possibly replace our vehicles, but we think they can. We cover a large rural area too, we have hills, and we're confident that our fleet can be replaced with electric bin lorries. And we also think that although they're expensive to purchase, they're cheap to run, cheap to service. We can charge them from our own solar PV. And if you have other things, I heard last week about a battery buyback scheme that could make the costs comparable. We're replacing all our electric vans and our electric cars. And an innovative scheme here, I've not come across it anywhere else, is that we can make them available to the public through a car club scheme out of hours. Installing solar PV on our own properties, also retrofitting them, and we're really proud of the fact that we managed to achieve an EPC of A on 2 of our retrofitted properties. The Green Homes Grant, which has been in the news a lot for being a bit of a disaster in implementation, but it's been a bit more successful with councils. We got money for our own housing, and we're getting further funding that we hope we can target other households that have got low energy ratings. But we are a district council, so we do have to collaborate with our county council, and we're very lucky that our county council is pretty ambitious as well. So we have to collaborate on our city centre movement strategy, and the vision there is that we not only tackle poor air quality and congestion, pedestrians and cyclists can move around easily because the centre is largely free of traffic. And we did a consultation recently, or the county council did, and it was really encouraging to know that the more radical options of reducing traffic in the city were ones that the public wanted as well. All of these things have taken place during lockdown. So, you know, the move online has actually, in many ways, enabled more participation. But we did have to, with our people's jury, we had to provide some training, some computers, some broadband access even, to make sure that we have that complete participation. So, you know, if you want to be inclusive online, you may have to work a bit at it. The other big thing that we're doing that really has been a big piece of work that we've recruited extra staff for this year is reviewing our local plan with climate emergency in mind. So I've been tipped off that we're going to be really pleased with what's come out. I haven't seen it yet. The officers have been working on it for a few months. So there's a link there in the slides to update people on where we're at with that. But obviously, again, you know, as you've heard so often, we are limited by what we can do by government. We haven't been able for years to actually tell developers to build to zero carbon standards. We've also been supporting, again, a government grant community land trust to build houses to passive house standard. We've got a grassland management strategy. We heard about that this morning, the importance of being able to encourage insects and so on. So we've now looked at all of our spaces and changed the strategies we use to really encourage the insects and biodiversity. Lots of joint projects. This one to encourage curlews. Again, you'll be able to see the links. But the other big thing that we're able to do as a council is to work with brilliant local organisations. So we have an organisation called Futures in Lancaster. They approached us and said, look, we want to run this conference. How can you help us? And it was a no-brainer, really. We could offer them all of the accommodation that they needed to run the conference at the town hall. So that made all the difference to them. But really, is the sort of thing that councils can do without too much pain and cost. Unfortunately, of course, it happened online in the end last year, but we're hoping it can run this year in the town hall. And Food Futures have a very complex structure that, again, you can look at your leisure. And there are lots of ways in which we actively support and participate in this. And we support their Farm Start programme by providing land and match funding and so on. I've almost finished. We haven't heard enough about adaptation. We had a multi-million-pound flood risk management scheme after being hit by Storm Desmond in 2015, and that's just been completed. And one of the exciting things that also has taken up quite a lot of officer time and money as well from the council is working on Eden Project North, because we're hoping that will be really transformational from the area, but it's already having an influence in things like the Morecambe Bay curriculum, where they're working with the university and local colleges and schools on a curriculum that embodies the Eden Project's focus on education, ecology, community. They're committed to making development carbon neutral, encourage sustainable tourism, and basically setting the bar very high as a brilliant example of what can be done. So that was a quick whistle-stop tour. I'm sorry it went just over, Ed. And the slides will be available for you to look at in more detail. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. So that's great. I'm looking at the time. We have run over quite a bit, but I think there was a vast amount of information which everybody will be pleased to have heard. I have been trawling over the dozens and dozens of questions, trying to group them up into some areas that we can put to people. And I think I've got them into 4 or 5 main areas. So let's get going. The idea is that I'll try to address it maybe to 2 of the panel to begin with. If others would then like to comment, please feel free to unmute and comment if you're on the panel. But let's start with at least 2 people. I think the first thing probably is on target setting. I mean, we did have a plea from the scientists in the initial sessions this morning that the target should be as early as possible. And what you hear from quite a lot of councils when they're setting them is that target is not deliverable, we'll never make it. So I think Edwina's comments at the beginning of the session about not looking at it being deliverable were very pertinent. So maybe, Edwina, would you please maybe address that in a little bit more detail on selecting the target and why you should do it, even if it might not be deliverable?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a tough one. I think Cornwall Council as an authority is more likely to be carbon neutral by 2030 than the whole of Cornwall, if I'm honest, because we're in control of our own destiny, and there's plenty of things that the council just does not have control of. So the motion actually said to call on government to provide the budgets, the money and the powers to allow us to do that. And currently that's not really happening as it could do. So we set 2030, and we always say that it's ambitious and we want to strive towards it, because I think if you put something too far into the future, people think, oh, that's okay, I've got plenty of time. I mean, it is an emergency. So we try to be realistic about what we can achieve. So on the council side, we have got a route map. So we have mapped out our key emitting bits of our organisation, and that includes, like other authorities, a complete reorganisation of our office space. We've still got 4,000 officers working from home. We've called it the snappy title of target operating model. I don't know why, but it's also part of a Lib Dem ethos of localism, and it was no coincidence that climate change and localism were embedded in the same portfolio. So it's about reconnecting with our communities, and I think that will help us better to achieve that. So it's ambitious, but we felt that we needed to set something that was ambitious to show that it was an emergency. The only thing else I would add, that when we were leading up to when we declared the emergency, there was quite a lot of pressure on us from other organisations, whether that was XR or other Extinction Rebellion, and that was what we should do. So there was a little bit of an external pressure to that. But I proposed the motion, so I was dead keen that we should be ambitious. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. That's great. If I could now address it, please, to Steve. Could you take the same question, please?
Yes, of course. Yeah, well, the 2030, it clearly, it was ambitious, as was just said, and it's aspirational. And I was getting some of my own group saying, but hold on, government say 2050. Why are we aiming at 2030? Well, my simple answer to that is, well, if we know it's an emergency, and on one hand we're saying emergency, why are we looking too far ahead and thinking about it later? If it's an emergency, we have to make it an emergency, and 2030 is an obvious target. I'd like it to be 2025, frankly. You know, we'll do what we can, and if you put emergency as a word, you have to go as soon as possible and just get on with it. And that's really, you know, that's where our strategy has come from, our action plan, etc. So I'm very pleased that we've done that and we've achieved it, and we're heading in the right direction.
And how easy was it to persuade your particularly Conservative colleagues that they should follow your advice on that?
Well, if I was to use the wording, and I don't think I'll offend any of them by saying it, it's like herding cats. You probably get the gist of it. It was not easy. It needed a lot of diplomacy, thought process, logic, explanation, and backwards and forwards. You know, the motion went backwards and forwards between myself and the opposition member. And finally, we got to a set of words that we could all agree on. And it was just a bit of work. That's all it took.
Oh, brilliant. Well done.
Can I add a point to Ed?
Go ahead, Edwina.
I think even within the Lib Dem group, not that there were any climate deniers or skeptics among them, but we are the most deprived region of the UK. So there were the comments that came forward, well, isn't there a housing emergency? Isn't there a mental health emergency? So the debate wasn't about whether or not we should declare emergency. It was there were competing demands, and that's really the social justice piece that led us to the climate change decision making wheel. But my view was that dealing with climate and loss of biodiversity superseded all of those, and that actually the poorest in our community would be most adversely affected by climate change and least able to take action.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you. I think that probably leads us on to another slew of questions, which came upon embedding sustainability and net zero targets into the culture of the council, the organisation, and ultimately, I imagine, the area. But if I could start by then putting this to our other two speakers first, not cutting out both Edwina and Steve, but maybe if Michael would like to comment first. Michael, in Nottingham, how was Nottingham getting on embedding this aim and the area of sustainability and net zero targets into all decision making? I can't see you on my screen, Michael. Are you unmuted? No? Okay. Kevin, would you like to take that one? Are people hearing me? Yes. Okay, nice. Right, all right. Well, let's bring it back then to Steve and Edwina then. Edwina, sorry, embedding sustainability and the net zero targets into the culture of the council.
Yes, so I think that this is about leadership. So luckily, the leader of the council, Councillor German, made this his priority for his leadership, along with Cornish culture. So it came very much from the cabinet, but I think it's the partnership between that and the senior officer. So the senior responsible officer was the chief executive, and that meant it was embedded right smack bang in the middle of the organisation, and the senior leadership team all embraced it, and we just it was almost a bit like a super tanker, and it's a huge organisation, you know, a £1.2 billion organisation. So it was no mean feat to get that embedded into all our 5,500 officers. So there was a little bit of the political bottom up. Our communities actually helped. So we had the pressure from quite rightly from our communities, but also the top down. So I think the climate literacy training, which I've heard other speakers talk about, and we had green champions within the organisation as well. And they're in revenues and bends, they're in housing, they're across the piece. So we had them embedded, you know, that it was fifth columnists in there that were helping their fellow officers to take action and informing and educating. So we hope to roll out the carbon literacy to all members in the new authority in May, but we've completely embedded it not just in the council, but in the enterprise partnership, in the nature partnership, in working with it. I think we are lucky in Cornwall that we're coterminous with all these other organisations, the NHS in Cornwall. So it was really it sounds a cliche, but a team Cornwall approach. And there's a passion in Cornwall. I'm sure that there is passion in other parts of the UK, but there's something about Cornwall working together to make a difference, that sort of, when the chips are down, we do come together.
Brilliant, thank you. Steve, if I could just extend it to you, but actually say, it goes on to not just getting embedded in the culture, but making sure that every single decision within the council was taken with a view coming from the climate emergency declaration. So how did you handle that?
Well, similar sort of thing, really. Having said that, our strategic officers were already of that mindset and that viewpoint. It's pretty much embedded into the Isle of Wight. You know, we're very environmental minded. When it comes to the connection from the motion to, you know, to get this actually embedded into the council, I'm reminded of an email I had in the process, as I was dealing with the process backwards and forwards to get this motion worded. There was an email I received from a senior officer who pointed out, warned me that if we do this, we then have to do all these other things, all these things have to come together, and it has to be embedded into the council. And there's a cost to that in man hours, and and physical funding. But I didn't see that as a reason not to do it, because for the same reason as I said before, this is, you know, an ambition, as aspiration. Doesn't mean if we can't do something because of funding, we have to find another way. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have that ambition. So that encouraged me actually to, you know, push on harder and make sure we get climate emergency declared, because that then does go into the DNA of the council, and a lot of it was already embedded. It just needed political direction. So once we put all that together, at that time I'm responsible for environment now. I wasn't at the time, waste management and procurement. So we then brought out our procurement strategy, which had everything to do with climate change because it had to. So that became automatically embedded, and things like, I mean, funding. Yeah, okay. We then think, well, let's decarbonise all our council buildings. That's not easy to do. However, we applied for a government grant and got 2.6 million. So now we can do it. So right. Just because you know something might be difficult or needs funding doesn't mean you can't do it. That's not a reason to not declare climate emergency and get on with it.
Absolutely. It's not about it being deliverable. It's about it being necessary. And once you get started, you'll find the solutions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. I've noticed Kevin's back. I am going to move on to another question. We are meant to be at the end of our time. If the speakers are happy, we'll probably run on for another 10 or 15 minutes, if that's okay. Are the speakers happy with that? Okay, right, wonderful. I think the next one is because a number of people asked about community energy. So it would be interesting to just highlight some of the bits on community energy. I'm sure all three of you are doing things on it, but I might take it to Kevin first. Within what you're doing, Kevin, in Lancaster, are there any tips for getting community energy projects going, getting them funded, and any pitfalls you would have or you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually where I started 10 years ago with setting up a community energy cooperative in Gloucestershire. And we had a real problem at the time with trying to persuade the council to let us put solar panels on their buildings. And those were the days when there were really generous feed-in tariffs. I don't think there's not quite the same problem now with a lack of enthusiasm from councils. So, you know, the first thing is, you know, do actively encourage community groups to partner with you and do that. There's several problems. A lot of community energy groups were putting solar panels on schools, and that's the Department for Education have called a halt to that. There's the cut in the feed-in tariff. I'm director of the Halton Loon Hydro, which is one of the biggest community-owned hydros schemes in the country. That was only possible by a big feed-in tariff. So now the only way really to make projects stack up, certainly in this part of the country, is if you have that direct private wire link to a building. So again, you know, if you're not going to do it yourself, then encourage community groups to do it. So we've got all of the energy hubs promoting the Rural Community Energy Fund. That's definitely something to be shouting about, because that gives you development money to, you know, however much you think a project's going to be viable or not, then they provide the money to check that out. So you can promote that to communities. So yeah, just encourage, cooperate, and inform, I guess, is the message.
Sorry, Edwina or Steve, who would like to go first?
I'm happy to. Yeah, so community energy is a challenge in Cornwall because we're so rural and disparate, so lots of scattered rural communities, but we've got two notable exceptions. There is the Chasewater down outside Truro, got a community energy group, and a long established one is Wren. It's the Wadebridge Renewable Energy Group. But as a local authority, we've just approved it for council on Tuesday, a £30 million renewable energy fund.
Fantastic.
And that tops up an existing £16 million fund. So I don't think it's perhaps as well developed in Cornwall as perhaps it could be. The problem has been the feed-in tariffs and viability. It just hasn't, like I say, our wind turbine was the first in Cornwall since 2016, and that was only viable because we went into partnership with Centrica. It's been a real problem. Cornwall Farms is something we've just reviewed on management plans for Cornwall Farms. There's 87 of them. So we've got an investment pot there to help our farms put renewable energy to aid their operation. But I'd be looking for perhaps some guidance from others, because maybe I'm just not so knowledgeable on it. I know a little, but I think this is important. We've removed in our own housing development programme £600 million. We're acting as developers basically. So we've removed, we're not going to have any gas connections. So we're looking at energy plants and district heating systems. So we don't have, so we're removing it from things that we're involved in. But community side, there are revolving funds out there to help them. But I could do with some guidance from others that perhaps are more advanced.
Okay, great. Steve, if you'd like to do a very quick comment on that, and then we've got one last question each, I think, and then we're finishing.
Yeah, sure. Yes, similar sort of thing, as we're a very rural area as well. Yeah, we have a couple of solar farms and what have you, but our grid is at the max, so we can't add anything more to it. Just very briefly, I would say something about, I'm chairman of trustees of a community bus service, and we're trying to go fully electric with the buses. And we want to put in solar panels. That's fine, we can do that. But of course, there's different times of the year, summer and winter. So we want to put a wind turbine in as well. The problem we've run into is the wind turbine and planning, trying to get that through planning. That's becoming an issue. So there's a crossover between community things that you want to do and planning issues. If we can get over that one, then we've pretty well done it. And of course, then there's the raw cost of the vehicle. They're pretty high at the moment, although we think we've got an answer to that, and I'll find out more about that on Friday. So there's some interesting stuff going on. If we can do it, it'll be great.
Right, great. I'm just making a note of the time, not only because we've got another session ourselves starting at 2. So we're down to literally the last couple of minutes. And now I'm going to throw in a question really directed at Isle of Wight and Cornwall, though Kevin will be happy to come in as well later if you like. And it's a double question, so if you can spend a few seconds on each, but it's really going to be short. Flooding. So the prospect of rising sea levels in the future, which will be affecting all of your coastlines. So that's talking about what you're doing now and what you're thinking of doing in terms of investment and mitigation over the next decades. And then on top of that, a secondary one related to coasts is seaweed and kelp, which are obviously fantastic for sequestering carbon. Actually very, very vulnerable to global heating, but just wanted to know what you're doing to encourage those. But literally, I apologise, it's 1 minute each on the double topic. So who would like to start?
Ladies first.
Oh, thank you, that's very kind. So our development plan document that's in the final stages, there's policies in there about shoreline management, about creating coastal change zones. So it's not about hard defences. So up on the Tamar River, the far reaches of the Tamar, there has been some land that's been flooded there deliberately to try and accommodate that. So I think this is about adapting the way we do things. But in my own hometown of Looe in south east Cornwall has the reputation of being the most flooded town in the UK. And I don't say that as a boast, but I think Cornwall is at we're almost the flood defence scheme for the rest of the country. We get it first from those southwest storms. So we are putting in a little bit of hard infrastructure, and the council, we're talking about £40–50 million scheme, way beyond what Cornwall Council can achieve. But we have invested £4 million in the development of that work, but it's very much linked to economic regeneration, because if the town keeps flooding, it costs an absolute arm and a leg when we lose business. Although most of the businesses in the town, and I used to work in a restaurant in the town, and they used to issue us with wellies, so we just carried on. Water came in and we just carried on serving. So we've learnt to adapt in Lou, but I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for us, that how we're going to persuade people that they may have to give up a bit of land and just let it happen, against putting in hard defences. So the Shoreline Management Plan is the document where you really look at those long-term plans, and we're just I think it's coming in.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there. Sorry, Steve. So 60 seconds, really 60 seconds. And then
yeah, that was
30.
Sorry,
no worry. Fairly similar scenario, really. I mean, I refer to one of my reports that I did a while ago, when I took a picture of. Well, I obtained a picture of the polar ice cap in I think it was 1976, and it was like this. And then it was much, years later, it was like this. Well, pretty obviously, if that's happening, which it is, that water's got to go somewhere. Our sea levels are rising. We're an island. We've been battered left, right, and centre. We have erosion all around our coast. We're members of the Southern Region Flood Defence Committee, which has a pool of money, a pot of government money, and we've called some off recently, which helped. And we're doing around East Cowes, we're doing some defences there, and we will call for more in the future, I'm sure. But if we don't do something, as an island, we'll disappear.
Yes, right. Thank you. Although not a great note to finish on. Kevin?
Yeah, just we're both coastal and inland, so we're cooperating with the University, Environment Agency, Rivers Trusts on natural flood management to see if that can help, because we get flooding not just from the sea, and we've built a very nice looking seawall actually that it has enhanced Morecambe Promenade, but we also get it inland from the hills as well. So natural flood management, building hard defences, and just getting used to it as well, and making ourselves, our power went out for 48 hours. There's a brilliant study that shows how people managed without electricity for 2 days across the whole of Lancaster, but then we had to make the electricity supply more resilient. So increasing resilience as well is key. Thanks, Ed.
Great, thank you very much, everybody. We've run right on to the absolute last minute we could possibly be here. Thank you so much to all of our councillors who turned up to talk. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Edwina. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kevin. We really hope it's inspired everybody, and if everybody's got any questions, please feel free to send them through to us at Scientists Warning Europe, and we will get them through to the speakers if they can help with anything. And let's all please drive this action forward. 2030 as a target. You'll have seen Kevin's pledge coming out for all candidates coming up into the forthcoming elections in all areas that have them. So that's a pledge where candidates are saying that they would support a 2030 net zero target, and all of those talking today are examples of places that have 2030 net zero targets. So let's please support that and go forward towards that. So thank you very much, everybody. Please look on our YouTube for all the films in the future, and our next session is in literally 15 minutes. On food strategies for councils. All the best. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.